Review and recap series for Making of America 1789 to 1900. Within this video we're going to have a look at the fourth theme within Making of America, which is settlement and conflict on the plains 1861 to 1877. A key term that we're going to be using throughout is migration, and this is where Americans themselves are moving west within America. Okay, this is not people coming from Europe, for example. This is Americans moving from the east of the United States of America to the west. So migration will be a key term as we go through. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do, which is going to allow us to see how many people came to settle on the plains, is look at the railroads. We're going to have a look at their construction. These points will come up in purple, so how the railroads were actually made and the impact that they had on the natives and on the plains themselves. Okay, so first of all, this may seem a little bit confusing at first because the previous topic that we had a look at was Civil War and Reconstruction, which was 1861 to 1877. What you will notice is that this theme, which is the fourth theme within Making of America, runs parallel, so it has the same dates. So we know that Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. We are now going back to 1862 when we are looking at the plains. So Civil War and Reconstruction is the third topic within the course, but the dates that operate within that theme are also used in the fourth theme of settlement and conflict on the plains. So just be aware of that and be careful when you're making notes as we go through. So Lincoln in 1862, which remember was during the American Civil War, passed the Pacific Railroad Act. Remember when Lincoln was making his promises in the hope that he was going to be elected in 1860, he had stated that he would build a railroad in the northern states of America. It was one of his promises, and it is something that he carries out. So in 1862, he states that the US government would provide money for any companies willing to make a railroad linking the eastern and western halves of the country. So remember, it's going to be built in the northern section of the country, and it's going to run from east to west. The US government also offered the railroad companies free land on either side of the track, which could be sold to settlers. So this is also an incentive, something that would make you want to join this initiative, because he's going to allow you to have land which you can then sell on. So you are going to make a lot of money if you help Lincoln with building this railroad. The railroad would make it easier for migrants to travel to the far west, but it would also allow white Americans to start farming on the plains. Now remember, this is going to be a problem. We have tribes on the plains such as the Lakota Sioux who are naturally going to end up being displaced as a result of the construction of the railroads actually being built. That's going to disturb their lifestyle. Remember, especially the buffalo, who they rely heavily on. And then also if these settlers start to actually stay on the plains, that is also going to affect their life. Okay, as the American Civil War was coming to an end, the American government could pump more money into the creation of the railroad. So because Lincoln now doesn't have to spend all the money that he's been spending on the Union Army, he now has a bit more money to put into the railroad creation. So in 1864, over $50 million was made available to encourage companies to build. The companies received 6,400 acres of land for every mile of track they built. So again, this is a massive incentive for companies to start building, and remember, they can sell this land on. The final point on construction is that 12,000 Chinese migrants were employed to do the dangerous work of tunnelling through the Rocky Mountains. So these men worked in extreme weather, they had disease, they lived in appalling conditions, they worked 6 days a week, and these were the people that really suffered during the construction. They were paid very poorly as well, so it was constructed predominantly by Chinese migrants. The railroad opens in 1869, so 4 years after the American Civil War. Obviously, Lincoln was not alive at this point to see that his plans had come to fruition, but it opens in 1869, so it is a successful venture. Okay, the impact then. So first of all, the impact on the Native Americans, which I touched upon earlier. So railroads were divided up the land where the natives hunted the buffalo. So remember, we said tribes such as the Lakota Sioux were nomadic, they heavily relied on the buffalo, so this is going to cause a problem. There were also cattle towns which started to be introduced, and these intruded on the vast areas of grassland needed for the natives to follow the buffalo. So this leads to violent clashes between the natives and the white Americans. We then have something called cow towns which emerge on the plains. So I'm sure you will have all seen some American kind of Western at some point, and the idea of the cowboy. This is where it comes from. Okay, cow towns emerged, and this is where cowboys would drink in saloons, so kind of the American Western version of a pub. They would gamble, they would sleep with prostitutes, they would engage in violence. So these were very unruly places, and these emerged on the plains. Now, this would obviously not fit in with what the natives thought the land was for. Remember, they thought a lot of the lands, such as the Black Hills, were sacred, so they are not going to be happy with these changes at all. A good example of a cow town, if you wanted one for the exam, is Abilene. So this is an example of a very unruly cow town which emerged as a result of the railroads. Finally, we have cattle ranches. So driving cattle from southern Texas to the cow towns made little sense. So what had happened prior to settlers actually taking land on the plains and growing their farms, their land for these cattle to be reared, they used to drive them to the cow towns. Now what they decide to do is that they are going to rear their cattle on the plains instead. This makes much more sense. They don't have to do that big drive anymore. However, it takes a lot of land from the Native Americans once again. So these ranches were open, so they didn't use fences, and this obviously leads to a scarcity of water and grass for the buffalo herds, and this is again going to affect the natives and their nomadic lifestyle, particularly tribes such as the Lakota Sioux. Okay, we then have a group called homesteaders. Homesteaders are farmers, essentially, but they live on the plains, so they have taken this native land again to build their own farm. So in 1862, again during the American Civil War, Lincoln passes something called the Homestead Act. This promised people 160 acres of plains land if they farmed it for a full 5 years and they paid a small fee. So this was very, very attractive. It was giving people the right to own their own land and they didn't have to pay much money. They weren't going to get this opportunity in the East because land was becoming more expensive. So the Homestead Act was very, very appealing to many people. Women were also allowed to apply as well as men. And it was an attractive opportunity for many to own their land for just a small price. It was also not cut off for African Americans. We're going to mention that later on, but it's worth noting that African Americans could also apply to own their own homestead or their own farm. Railroad companies produced lots of propaganda, which made the plains look like a desirable place to move to. So we did touch upon this when we looked at what the plains was like. So they promised that the land would be very easy to grow crops on, that people would make a lot of money. It wasn't necessarily true, but these were the kind of promises that railroad companies made. Remember, they want people to use the railroad, but also they have been given all of this land by Lincoln to then sell on to anybody that moves to the plains. So they want to sell this land. They want to make it look as desirable as possible. Okay, I touched upon this earlier, but land was now very expensive in the East and in California and Oregon in the West. So remember, California, for example, due to the gold rush, Oregon due to Pikes Peak gold rush. So we have seen these areas become extremely popular, and this has now meant that land has become more expensive. So land on the plains was cheaper. It would allow white Americans to fulfill their dreams to become independent farmers. So this now looks very attractive opportunity. Challenges on the plains. So this is something that the homesteaders didn't foresee. So the railroad companies made it look like a great place to be, but actually there were lots and lots of problems. We had grassland fires in the extreme heat in the summer, locusts who ate crops. The soil was extremely tough, so it was difficult to farm. It also broke the ploughs, which weren't strong enough to break up the soil. There was isolation. It was a very vast place. The nearest homesteader could be miles and miles away, so people felt very isolated, very cut off, very, very different from life in the East. There was a lack of water, diseases such as cholera and typhoid were very common. So although the promise of a homestead looked very appealing, the reality was actually very different. So again, yeah, I've just said the reality was very, very different from the promise. Although the homesteaders got their own land, there were many challenges once they arrived. And of course, they were the natural hazards on the plains. Conflict with the natives was only going to get worse. So why was there so much bloodshed on the plains? Okay, there were ecological tensions, so there was no mass competition for both land and water. We spoke about the cattle ranches needing water. We've spoken about settlers needing water for their homesteads generally, and the natives, remember, need this water supply as well for the buffalo and for their nomadic lifestyle. So there is no mass competition for this, and this is going to cause huge problems. Violence was increasingly likely to break out as a result of competition for resources. We also have hardening attitudes. So scientific theories of race proved to many white Americans that natives were inferior. So inferior meaning less important. Therefore, white Americans taking their land was seen as natural. So this is something that many white Americans believed, that it was just natural for them to come onto the plains and that natives should simply move out of the way for them. We also had another part to hardening attitudes, which was that many white Americans believed that the natives should be moved onto reservations. These were small areas of land. They had to survive on rations, or they had to resort to farming. They weren't used to farming. Remember, they had this nomadic lifestyle, so farming wasn't part of their culture at all, and they were in very cramped conditions. So reservations were somewhere that many white Americans thought the natives should simply move to and not argue with. Okay, the final point that we have is guns and fear. So by the 1850s, owning handguns was completely normal. Something called Winchester's repeating rifles were sold to hunters, farmers, local militia, so local armies, and Indians alike. So owning a rifle became a lot more natural, and the American Civil War had also led to increased gun ownership. By 1865, which remember is the end of the American Civil War, 1/3 of households owned at least one gun. So these households owning guns obviously makes bloodshed more likely. Somebody is in dispute with you over land, over resources, you're much more likely to resort to violence if you are armed. Okay, the next part is quite challenging, so I'm going to talk through these quite quickly. You have these notes that we've been through in class as well, but there are 5 Indian wars that you need to know about, and you don't need to know every detail for these at all. You are most likely to use these as evidence in an 18-mark question, so the large essay questions at the end of the America paper. If you were going to speak about trouble on the plains, you could use the Indian Wars and speak about them generally rather than just one specific war. So don't worry about knowing every single detail, but it would be good for you to know the names and the details of as many as possible. So I'll go through these with you now. The first war that we have is Little Crow's War. The cause of this is the Sioux, remember the main tribe on the plains, were refused food and the government wouldn't open emergency stores. So the Sioux were obviously extremely angry, and as a result of this, because they could potentially starve, the Sioux attacked 500 settlers who were slaughtered. So the Sioux do use violence. The consequence of this is Little Crow, who was one of the leaders of the Sioux, was beheaded and scalped and put on display. So very aggressive reaction from the white settlers and the government. 300 Sioux were put on trial, 38 were hanged and hundreds were imprisoned. So you can clearly see a very violent reaction from the white Americans to the natives. Okay, we then have the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. The cause of this was lots of gold miners moved to Cheyenne and Arapaho in Colorado, pushing the Indian tribes out. They hadn't enough food, so began hunting in the mining areas, and some also attacked white settlers. So again, it is because white Americans have encroached onto their areas, and they begin to attack white settlers in anger, really, of the fact that their food, their land is being taken. So the actions, we have Chivington, who is a white American general. He's put in charge of dealing with the Indian threat. He kills 105 Cheyenne women and children and 28 men. They cut scalps and genitalia from the corpses, which became trophies. So again, Very violent reaction from the white Americans. The consequence of this then, Colorado celebrated initially, and there was a parade for Chivington's men who rode through the streets with scalps hanging from their belts. So very vivid imagery here, and something that obviously would not be condoned at all today, but very, very violent reaction from Chivington, and initially he is praised. However, the government do launch an investigation, and 6 of Chivington's men were arrested, and Chivington was made to resign from the army. So because his actions were so aggressive, so bloodthirsty, he ends up in trouble as a result of that. We then have Red Cloud's War, 1865 to 68. Again, similar to the Fan Creek Massacre, it's the discovery of gold which has led to war between the Lakota Sioux this time and the US Army. A gold mining trail was put right through the Sioux's land. Remember, the Sioux are nomadic. They're the most nomadic tribe on the plains. They follow the buffalo everywhere. And so this gold mining trail is going to disrupt their livelihood. So the actions, the Lakota Sioux began attacking travellers along the Bozeman Trail, which was this gold mine trail. Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, who were members of Lakota Sioux, also attacked US Army forts. So 80 troops were killed, scalped and mutilated by the Sioux. So the Sioux here are using actions that Chivington had used in the Sand Creek Massacre, so they are getting their own back essentially. Red Cloud continued to achieve victories over the US government, so here we can clearly see that the natives have the upper hand, because they have they have used violence themselves. They've given a very violent reaction, and Red Cloud continues to achieve victory. So we can clearly see here that the natives are the strongest fighters in this particular war. The consequence then, the US government had to sign a treaty at Fort Laramie, which granted a vast amount of land to the Sioux, including the Black Hills of Dakota. Now, we've mentioned the Black Hills a few times. Remember, this is sacred land to the Lakota Sioux. They believe that their ancestors' spirits are here. So the US government give this land to the Sioux, and they assure the Indians that the US troops wouldn't enter their lands again without permission. Sadly, and probably unsurprisingly for you, this is not what happens. They make these promises, but they quickly go back on their word. So we then have the Great Sioux War, 1875 to 1877. Again, we have gold as a cause, and this time, sadly, it was found in the Black Hills of Dakota. So remember, this area, which was extremely sacred to the natives, there is now, sadly, being gold found here. So it was always unlikely that the US government were going to keep their promise of not entering this land. So many miners turned up to the Black Hills. Actions then, the government offered to buy the Black Hills for $6 million. Understandably, Sitting Bull, who again is a key member of the Sioux tribe, refuses this offer. Remember, they see the land as sacred. The government were furious and ordered Sioux troops back into the reservation forts. Sitting Bull refuses again, so he's very stubborn here. In 1876, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse wiped out a US Army camp by the Rosebud River and set up camp on the Little Bighorn River. Crazy Horse also attacked the advancing army of General Crook. The US soldiers were heavily defeated. So this is not going to go down well. They've offered the natives $6 million for their land. There has been huge violence on both sides, and the natives look as though they have come out on top. The Indian tribes retreated back to the Little Bighorn River, and they sit and wait, hoping that this will be the end of the violence. Unfortunately, again, this is not the case. So finally, we have the Battle of the Little Bighorn, 1876. We have General Custer of the US Army. He had been ordered to find Sitting Bull's army and drive them towards the main army. So we knew that the American government would be extremely angry about the result of the Great Sioux War. So it's unsurprising then that they send General Custer to deal with the situation. The actions then, 6,000 Indians were camped on Little Bighorn River. Custer was attacked with 210 men, leaving him outnumbered 4-1. Many white Americans weapons overheated or jammed, and Custer and all of his men were killed. So this is not the result at all that the US Army expected. The Indians did a great job of fighting back against the US Army. However, it looked as though it was a great victory, but the war couldn't be won as a whole, and this was because the US Army prevented the Indians from getting supplies. One of their main Sioux leader, so Crazy Horse, was killed, and the Sioux surrendered the Black Hills and 40 million acres of Indian land. And remember that Indian land, once again, was a very spiritual place for the Sioux. So those 5 wars, remember, you do not need to know in detail, but if you can learn a couple and know them really well for the exam, I would say that would be absolutely fine. You're most likely to use them, as I said, in that long essay question at the end of the exam paper. Okay, I would now advise that you test yourself on what we have learned. You've got 6 questions on the slide, the same as in the other videos. If you pause the video in a moment, write your answers down and then restart the video and I will go through the answers for you. Okay, number 1, what was passed in 1862 which made migration to the plains more likely? So we have the Pacific Railroad Act. Remember, this is by Lincoln and this is just after the start of the American Civil War. Number 2, name 2 main impacts the railroad had on the plains. So it divided up the native land. There were cow towns for the first time and there were cattle ranches as well, as people started to actually rear cattle on the plains rather than doing those drives that they'd had to do previously. Number 3, what was Lincoln's Homestead Act of 1862? This promised people 160 acres of land on the plains if they farmed it for a full 5 years and paid a small fee. So many people would have been excited by this prospect. It was their first chance to own land. Number 4, name 2 challenges which homesteaders faced in the West. Remember, it was promised to be almost an easy way of setting up a farm, but that proved to be untrue. There were lots of different challenges that you could have had if you just pick 2 from the examples that you can now see. So grassland fires, locusts, tough soil which breaks plows, isolation, lack of water, diseases such as cholera and typhoid. Number 5, what event had increased gun ownership in America, making bloodshed on the plains more likely? This is, of course, the American Civil War. And finally, name 2 causes of any of the Indian Wars. So you can see the answers on the board there for you. We have the gold miners. We have the fact that the US government ordered General Custer to find Sitting Bull's army. So go through those Indian Wars. As I said, as long as you've got a couple that you know in detail, that should be absolutely fine. Okay, the final topic of our course is American Cultures, 1877 to 1900. So make sure that you keep having a look over the videos that we have made so far and keep highlighting anything key in your notes.